He built an empire on secrets, a financier who moved through the world's most exclusive circles, shaking hands with presidents, princes, and billionaires. But beneath the mansions and private jets, beneath the carefully crafted image of success, there was something else, something darker. For decades, he hid in plain sight, protected by power, by money, by connections that reached into the highest levels of society. And then, on August 10th, 2019, it all came crashing down. A cell, a prison, a death that raised more questions than it answered. Jeffrey Epstein didn't just fall from grace. He took the world's trust with him. But before the headlines, before the arrests and the accusations, there was a boy from Brooklyn who learned early that money could buy anything, even silence. This is his story, from the beginning. Jeffrey Edward Epstein was born on January 20th, 1953, in Brooklyn, New York. His parents were ordinary people. His father, Seymour, worked for the New York City Parks Department. His mother, Pauline, was a school aide. They lived in a modest neighborhood called Seagate, a small gated community at the southern tip of Brooklyn. It was the kind of place where families knew each other, where children played in the streets, where life moved slowly and predictably. Nothing about Jeffrey's early years hinted at the darkness that would one day define him. He was smart. Teachers at Lafayette High School noticed that. He had a gift for mathematics, a sharp mind that could solve problems others found difficult. But he was not extraordinary. Not yet. He was just another bright kid from Brooklyn.
Ambitious in the way many young people are when they grow up without much and dream of more. He wanted wealth. He wanted power. He wanted to escape the limitations of his childhood and enter a world his parents could never afford to touch. After high school, Epstein enrolled at Cooper Union, a prestigious college in Manhattan. But he didn't stay long. He transferred to New York University, studying mathematics and physics. But again, something didn't stick. He left without finishing his degree. No diploma, no credentials. Just ambition and a growing understanding of how the world really worked. And somehow, that was enough. In 1973, at the age of 20, Jeffrey Epstein talked his way into a teaching position at the Dalton School, one of Manhattan's most elite private institutions. It was a stunning achievement for someone with no degree, no teaching experience, no formal qualifications. But Epstein had something else. He had charm. He knew how to present himself, how to make people believe he was more than he was. The headmaster at the time took a chance on him, and Epstein walked through the door. He taught math and physics to children of New York's wealthiest families. He was young, charismatic, and eager to impress. But more than teaching, he was learning. He was watching. He was studying the parents who dropped off their children in expensive cars, who wrote checks without hesitation, who lived in penthouses and summer homes. He was learning how wealth moved, how power operated, how influence was bought and sold in quiet conversations and knowing glances. Dalton wasn't just a job for Jeffrey Epstein, it was an education, and he was a very good student. For now, he was just a teacher, unremarkable on the surface, but inside, something was shifting. A hunger was growing, a willingness to do whatever it took to climb higher, to move faster, to leave Brooklyn far behind. He had charm, he had ambition, and soon he would have something far more dangerous: access.
At Dalton, Jeffrey Epstein wasn't satisfied with simply teaching. He was building something more valuable than a resume. He was building relationships. The parents of his students were investment bankers, corporate executives, lawyers who moved in the highest circles of New York society. And Epstein made sure they noticed him. He was attentive, intelligent, eager to please. He asked the right questions. He laughed at the right jokes. He made himself useful. And in those circles, Being useful was everything. In 1976, one of those connections changed his life. A parent at Dalton introduced him to someone at Bear Stearns, one of Wall Street's most powerful investment banks. Epstein had no formal training in finance. He had no business degree, no Wall Street pedigree,
But he had something the finance world valued just as much: the ability to read people. He knew how to make clients feel important, how to anticipate their needs, how to present himself as someone who understood their world. And that was enough. Bear Stearns hired him. At first, he worked in the back office, handling administrative tasks, learning the mechanics of trading and investment. But Epstein was a quick study. He absorbed everything. He understood not just the numbers, but the psychology behind them. He understood that money, at its highest levels, wasn't about mathematics. It was about trust, about secrecy, about knowing when to speak and when to stay silent. He rose quickly. By 1980, he'd been promoted to limited partner, a significant achievement for someone with his background.
he was no longer the kid from Brooklyn pretending to belong. He was inside. He had access to wealth, to information, to power. But then, something went wrong. In 1981, Epstein left Bear Stearns. The reasons were never made entirely clear. There were whispers of rule violations, of inappropriate conduct, of situations that made the firm uncomfortable. But nothing was ever proven. No charges were filed. No public scandal erupted. Epstein simply left. And in the world of high finance, that kind of quiet departure often said more than any official statement ever could. But Jeffrey Epstein did not disappear. He did not retreat. Instead, he did something bold. In 1982, he founded his own financial consulting firm, J. Epstein & Co. And he made a stunning claim. He would only work with billionaires. His minimum client threshold, he said,
Was $1 billion. Not millionaires, billionaires. It was an audacious strategy, one that immediately set him apart. But it also raised questions. Who were his clients? Where did his money come from? How did someone with such a thin resume suddenly have access to the world's wealthiest individuals? No one knew, and Epstein made sure it stayed that way. He operated in the shadows, cultivating an air of mystery that only made him more intriguing to those who valued discretion. He didn't advertise, he didn't seek publicity, he simply existed, quietly amassing wealth and influence, building a network of connections that stretched across continents and into the most exclusive circles of power. He had learned the most important lesson of all. In the world of the ultra-rich, secrecy wasn't just an advantage, it was currency. And Jeffrey Epstein was about to become very, very rich. By the 1990s, Jeffrey Epstein was no longer climbing. He had arrived. He owned a mansion on the Upper East Side of Manhattan, a sprawling estate in Palm Beach, a ranch in New Mexico. But his most infamous property was a 70-acre private island in the U.S. Virgin Islands. He called it Little St. James. The locals would eventually call it something else, something darker. Epstein's wealth was staggering, but its source remained unclear. He claimed to manage money for billionaires, but few could name them. He presented himself as a financier, a philanthropist, a man of science and culture. He donated to universities. He funded research. He hosted salons where Nobel laureates and academics gathered to discuss ideas. He cultivated an image of intellectual sophistication, positioning himself not just as wealthy, but as important, as someone who mattered. And the world seemed to believe him. He moved effortlessly among the elite. He flew on a private jet, a customized Boeing 727 that would later be nicknamed the Lolita Express. He counted presidents, princes, and billionaires among his friends. Bill Clinton flew with him. Donald Trump socialized with him. Prince Andrew visited his properties. Scientists, academics, celebrities, All were drawn into his orbit. Epstein knew how to make powerful people feel special. He knew how to offer them something they couldn't get elsewhere: privacy, exclusivity, access. But beneath the surface, something else was happening. Something that would remain hidden for years, protected by layers of money, influence, and fear. Young girls were being brought to Epstein's properties. They were told they would give massages,
That they would be paid well, that it was easy work. Some were recruited from shopping malls, from schools, from vulnerable situations where a few $100s could change everything. They were 14, 15, 16 years old. Children. And they were being used. Epstein didn't act alone. There were others who helped him, who recruited, who arranged, who ensured the system kept running smoothly. And at the center of it all was Ghislaine Maxwell, daughter of the late British media mogul Robert Maxwell. She was sophisticated, well-connected, trusted by the girls she approached. She made them feel safe, and then she delivered them to Epstein. For years, the abuse continued. Girls came and went. Some were paid and told to bring friends. The network expanded, and the walls Epstein had built around himself, walls made of money, of power, of carefully cultivated relationships, kept the truth from getting out. Victims were silenced, either by money or by fear, or by the crushing realization that no one would believe them. Who would take the word of a teenage girl over a man who flew with presidents? Epstein's Island became a symbol of his untouchability, a place where the rules didn't apply, where wealth and influence created a world unto itself, hidden from scrutiny, protected by distance and secrecy. He believed he was invincible. For a long time, he was right. But every wall, no matter how high, has cracks. And in 2005, one mother in Palm Beach decided that her daughter's story needed to be heard. She went to the police. And slowly, inevitably, the wall began to crumble. It started with a single phone call. In March 2005, a mother in Palm Beach contacted local police. Her 14-year-old daughter had been assaulted by a wealthy man. She gave them a name: Jeffrey Epstein. The police began to investigate, and what they found was worse than anyone had imagined. There were more victims, many more. As detectives dug deeper, girls came forward, one after another, each telling a similar story. They had been recruited, often by other girls, and brought to Epstein's Palm Beach mansion. They were told they would give massages. They were paid, sometimes a few $100s, sometimes more. But the massages were never just massages. Epstein touched them. He assaulted them. He made them perform acts they didn't want to perform. And then he sent them away, often with instructions to bring friends.
The detectives interviewed dozens of girls. They gathered evidence. They built a case. And what emerged was not the story of a single crime, but of a system, a network, a machine designed to exploit vulnerable young girls and keep them silent. The police searched Epstein's mansion. They found massage tables, photographs of nude girls, phone numbers, schedules. The evidence was overwhelming. In 2006, the case was brought to the Palm Beach Police Department's attention. They recommended multiple felony charges, but the local state attorney declined to prosecute at that level. Instead, the case was handed over to federal authorities. And that's when everything changed. Federal prosecutors in the Southern District of Florida began building a case. They identified more than 30 victims, some as young as 13. They prepared charges that could have sent Jeffrey Epstein to prison for the rest of his life. Sex trafficking, abuse of minors, conspiracy. It was a case that should have ended with justice, but it didn't. In 2007, something extraordinary happened. Alexander Acosta, the U.S. Attorney for the Southern District of Florida, made a deal, a secret deal. Epstein's powerful legal team negotiated an agreement that would become one of the most controversial plea bargains in American history. Epstein would plead guilty to 2 state charges: soliciting prostitution and procuring a minor for prostitution. In exchange, he would serve 13 months in a county jail, not a federal prison. And he would be granted work release, allowing him to leave the facility 6 days a week, 12 hours a day, to work from his office. The deal also included something even more troubling. It granted immunity to any potential co-conspirators. Anyone who had helped Epstein, who had participated in his crimes, would be protected. The victims were not consulted. They were not informed. The deal was signed in secret, buried in legal language, hidden from public view. In June 2008, Jeffrey Epstein pleaded guilty. He served his 13 months in a private wing of the Palm Beach County Stockade. He was allowed to leave almost every day. He continued to run his business, to meet with associates, to maintain his life. It was not punishment. It was inconvenience. In July 2009, he was released. He registered as a sex offender, a label that should have marked him, that should have ended his access to power. But it didn't. He returned to his mansions, his island, his private jet. He returned to his life. And the world, for the most part, moved on. But the victims did not forget. And neither did a few journalists who believed the story wasn't over. The cracks in the wall were small, but they were there. And in time, they would become too large to ignore. For nearly a decade, Jeffrey Epstein lived quietly. His name rarely appeared in the news. His crimes were known only to those who had been hurt by them, and to a small circle of lawyers, investigators, and journalists who refused to let the story die. Epstein continued to move among the wealthy and powerful. He attended conferences, he funded research, he maintained his image as a financier and philanthropist. To most of the world, he was a footnote. A registered sex offender, yes, but one who had served his time and paid his debt. The system had spoken. The case was closed. But it wasn't. Not really. Because while Epstein had been allowed to walk free, his victims were still living with the consequences of what he had done. They carried the trauma, the shame, the anger of a justice system that had failed them, and some of them were determined to make sure the world knew the truth. In November 2018, Julie K. Brown, an investigative reporter for the Miami Herald, published a series of articles titled Perversion of Justice. The series was explosive. Brown had spent months tracking down Epstein's victims, interviewing them, giving them a platform to tell their stories. She exposed the corruption of the 2008 plea deal, revealing how federal prosecutors had secretly negotiated with Epstein's lawyers while keeping victims in the dark. She detailed the scope of his crimes, the number of girls who had been hurt, the systemic failure that had allowed him to escape real punishment. The response was immediate and overwhelming. The public was outraged. Advocacy groups demanded accountability. Lawmakers called for investigations. The story that had been buried for a decade was suddenly front-page news. And this time, there was no escaping it. Federal prosecutors in the Southern District of New York reopened the case. They reviewed the evidence, interviewed witnesses, and prepared new charges. On July 6, 2019, Jeffrey Epstein was arrested at Teterboro Airport in New Jersey. He had just returned from Paris. Federal agents took him into custody without incident. He was charged with sex trafficking of minors and conspiracy to commit sex trafficking. The charges covered conduct that had occurred between 2002 and 2005, the same period covered by the 2008 plea deal. But this time, prosecutors argued, the deal was invalid. This time, there would be no leniency. Epstein was taken to the Metropolitan Correctional Center in Manhattan, a federal detention facility. He requested bail, offering to post millions of dollars and remain under house arrest in his Manhattan mansion. But the judge denied the request. Epstein was deemed a flight risk, a danger to the community. He would remain in custody until trial. The world waited. Victims prepared to testify. Prosecutors built their case. It seemed, finally,
that Jeffrey Epstein would face the full weight of the justice system, that the truth would come out, that there would be accountability. But on the morning of August 10th, 2019, everything changed. Guards at the Metropolitan Correctional Center found Jeffrey Epstein unresponsive in his cell. He had fashioned a noose from bedsheets and hanged himself. He was 66 years old. Paramedics attempted to revive him, but he was pronounced dead at a nearby hospital. The official ruling was suicide.
An autopsy confirmed it, but the circumstances were deeply suspicious.
Epstein had been placed on suicide watch after a previous incident, but had been removed just days before his death. The guards assigned to monitor him had failed to check on him for hours. Security footage from the hallway outside his cell was reportedly corrupted or missing. The facility itself was understaffed, chaotic, plagued by systemic failures. The questions came immediately. How could someone so high profile, facing such serious charges, be left unsupervised? Who benefited from his death? What secrets had died with him? Conspiracy theories spread rapidly. Some believed he had been murdered to protect powerful people whose names might have been revealed at trial. Others believed the system had simply failed, as it so often does. The truth, perhaps,
is somewhere in between. What is certain is this: Jeffrey Epstein's death ensured that many questions would never be answered, that many names would never be revealed, that justice, once again, would be incomplete.
Jeffrey Epstein was gone, but his story was far from over. His death sparked a wave of investigations, legal battles, and public demand for answers. The Southern District of New York announced that the criminal case against Epstein would be closed, but that the investigation would continue. They were looking at others, at those who had helped him, who had enabled him, who had benefited from his crimes. At the center of that investigation was Ghislaine Maxwell. For years, she had been Epstein's closest associate, his confidant, his partner in crime. Victims had named her repeatedly. She had recruited them, groomed them, reassured them that everything was normal. She had been there, in the room, watching, participating. And after Epstein's arrest, she had disappeared. For months, no one knew where Maxwell was.
She moved between safe houses, kept a low profile, avoided contact with the outside world. But on July 2nd, 2020, the FBI found her. She was arrested at a secluded property in New Hampshire, charged with conspiracy to entice minors to travel to engage in illegal sex acts, transportation of a minor with intent to engage in criminal sexual activity, and perjury. The charges carried decades in prison. Maxwell's trial began in November 2021. For weeks, the world watched as victims took the stand, one after another, and described what had been done to them. They spoke of being recruited as teenagers, of being manipulated and abused, of being told that what was happening was normal. They spoke of Epstein, and they spoke of Maxwell, of how she had made them feel safe, right up until the moment she handed them over. On December 29, 2021, the jury found Ghislaine Maxwell guilty on 5 of 6 counts. In June 2022, she was sentenced to 20 years in federal prison. It was a victory for the survivors, a moment of accountability that had been a long time coming. But it was not complete. Because Maxwell, like Epstein, refused to name names. She did not cooperate. She did not reveal the full scope of the network they had built. In the months and years that followed, court documents were slowly unsealed. Depositions, flight logs, emails, all became public. Names appeared. Some were already known, others were new. The documents revealed a web of connections that stretched across continents into the highest levels of business, politics, science, and entertainment. But many questions remained unanswered. How did Epstein make his money? Who exactly were his clients? Who else knew what was happening and chose to look the other way? The Epstein Files became a symbol, not just of one man's crimes, but of a system that had protected him for decades. A system where wealth could buy silence, where power could shield the guilty,
where justice could be delayed or denied entirely. The files revealed uncomfortable truths about how the world works, about who gets held accountable and who doesn't, about the ways institutions fail the vulnerable in favor of the influential. Survivors continue to fight. Some have filed civil lawsuits against Epstein's estate, seeking compensation for the harm done to them. Others have become advocates, speaking out, demanding reforms, ensuring that their stories are heard. They have refused to be silenced. And in doing so, they have changed the conversation around sexual abuse,
Around power, around accountability. The Epstein Files are more than a criminal case. They are a mirror held up to society, reflecting back the darkness that thrives in secrecy. And they are a reminder that the fight for justice is never truly over. Jeffrey Epstein is dead, but his name lives on. Not as a financier or a philanthropist, but as a symbol of everything wrong with unchecked power. His story forced the world to confront uncomfortable truths about wealth, about privilege, about complicity, about the ways systems protect the powerful and fail the vulnerable. Epstein's crimes were not committed in isolation. He had help. He had enablers. He had people who knew, or should have known, and chose to look the other way. Some were complicit, others were simply indifferent. But the result was the same. For years, girls were hurt, and no one stopped it. For years, Epstein operated with impunity, shielded by money and connections. His death left a void, not of mourning, but of unfinished business. There are still questions that will never be answered, still names that will never be revealed, still secrets that died with him. The full scope of his network may never be known, and for his victims, that is another kind of injustice. But his legacy is not only one of darkness, it is also one of courage. The survivors who came forward, who told their stories despite the risk, despite the disbelief, despite the trauma of reliving what had been done to them, they changed the world. They forced prosecutors to act. They forced the media to pay attention. They forced society to reckon with the reality of abuse and the systems that enable it. Epstein's story exposed the lies we tell ourselves, that justice is blind, that money doesn't matter, that power doesn't corrupt. His case proved beyond any doubt that those things are not true, that the rich and powerful play by different rules, that justice, too often, is a privilege, not a right. But it also proved something else, that silence can be broken, that systems can be challenged, that even the most powerful can be held accountable if enough people refuse to look away. The Epstein Files remain a warning, a reminder that darkness thrives in secrecy, that abuse flourishes when we choose not to see it, that justice delayed is justice denied. But they are also a call to action, a demand for transparency, for accountability, for a world where no one is above the law. Jeffrey Epstein believed he was untouchable. For a long time, he was right. But in the end, the truth found him. And the survivors he tried to silence became the voices that ensured his crimes would never be forgotten. No one is above the law. Not forever. Not anymore.